Today, mostly I'm going to spend my time talking about the Great Depression. Of course, one of the first things I will talk about is the beginning of the Depression under Herbert Hoover. I'll talk about how Hoover just doesn't really, not able to really fix the problems of the Great Depression. I'll even talk about all the migrants and the Dust Bowl that came about. And I had that little short video I just showed you. It was like, of course, a video from a song by Woody Guthrie called Do Re Mi, which is really about, these guys like the Okies, fleeing the Dust Bowl and going to California. And he's saying, don't go because you don't have any money. The Do Re Mi is money. He's talking about, you're just, it's going to be like a hell instead of a heaven. Of course, a lot of people don't want to live in California today. A lot of people are leaving, if you know about that, because it's just so bad over there and high taxation. So, yeah, it's not really an Eden back then or even now, I guess, more or less. So anyway, so I'm going to go ahead and move on and, of course, first talk about the Great Depression. So, yeah, the Great Depression starts about, like I said, 1929. I had talked about from the previous lecture about how it started with a stock market crash. Remember that? In October of 1929, stock market crashed and everybody lost all their money. And then from there, it spread throughout the country. All the businesses, banks closed. People lost their homes, their farms, etc. Nobody had any money. And then it spread also around the world. I didn't really get into that, but the Great Depression spread to other countries throughout the world. And of course, it affected Europe later, if you know about that. Probably helped cause like the rise of like the fascists like Hitler, later led to, World War II, which we'll get to maybe within a week or so. But anyway, I want to first talk about what happened at the beginning of the Great Depression. Of course, things didn't go well. You know about that under Herbert Hoover. I'll get to the Dust Bowl in a second here about that. But under Herbert Hoover, that's when the Great Depression really mostly starts, at least from the first few years of it, I guess from 1929 to part of 1933. He was the beginning of the whole Great Depression. And of course, Hoover really didn't solve any problems associated with the Great Depression. And Hoover was often blamed for it. He was blamed for the Great Depression. He was accused of being incompetent, unsympathetic, withdrawn into the White House, kind of a hermit in the White House. Of course, a lot of people thought that, part of why he failed to maybe alleviate the Depression was a lot of his philosophies he had about life, which I told you before. I told you about rugged individualism, and Hoover was one of these guys that believed that you should pull yourself up by your bootstraps and not rely on government assistance and things like that. He really believed that, and he thought that also, he kept saying, by the way, that prosperity was just around the corner. Things were just going to get better, and of course it didn't. And like I said, so people blamed him for the Great Depression. He became the butt of many jokes to people, and so that led to the term you may have heard of called Hooverism. You may have heard of Hooverism. And people began building shanty towns where homeless people lived. They were called a Hooverville. I think I've got some pictures showing the Hoovervilles here. Yeah, so some of these people live in these shanty towns. Were kind of like these shacks or tents. You sometimes see like homeless people today living in something like that today, more or less, over the years. So it was called that because people felt like Hoover wasn't really doing anything to try to alleviate the problems that was associated with the Great Depression and all that. And it led to here's more pictures of shanty towns which you're looking at right here, which a lot of these could be made out of anything, like, scrap metal, I think was a common thing that they would make it out of, even like living in their cars and stuff like that also as well. So all kinds of things. And they also have what they call Hooverisms. Have you know about this? And so people blamed him so much for the Great Depression that they came up with these nicknames for different things, like a Hoover car that was just had a horse with it. You can see there was called a Hoover wagon. People would sleep in newspapers instead of a blanket, so they called it a Hoover blanket. If you had an empty pocket turned inside out, it's called a Hoover flag. You heard of that before. People would sometimes eat like other animals that weren't, normally you would eat like armadillos or something like that, or I think jackrabbits or something like that. They would call it a Hoover hog. Abandoned cars are called a Hoover car. You see there, Hoover bag was suitcase with holes in it. Hoover shoes. There's shoes with holes in the soles. So stuff like that. So all kinds of things like that. Of course, they used to describe the time period and all the different things associated with it. Oh, and of course, hobos were everywhere, which, I was talking about, let me bring it up here, but I was talking about Woody Guthrie, who at one point, he's this guy that was a migrant going all over the country. He actually lived as a hobo himself, and he traveled all over the country, traveled in boxcars, like in railroads. And so these guys were called, bums or tramps, back in the old days. I remember my mom telling me stories about this, like, long time ago when she was young, because the railroad was nearby, and they'd have hobos that would come by, and she would leave them food, because a lot of them didn't have much money or much food. And Woody Guthrie, became one of the first great folk singers in American history. And wrote a lot about this period of the Great Depression. Of course, his most famous song is "This Land Is Your Land," which is almost like an American national anthem in a sense, which you may have heard of that song and all that. So he was an interesting guy. He was kind of controversial though, because he was kind of this. He was kind of socialist, or he was a socialist or communist. I couldn't remember which one it is, but he was one of those famous for having this sticker on his guitar that said, "This machine kills fascists." Just kind of well known. So that's Woody Guthrie. We kind of showed that video, of course, with his song, Do Re Mi. Now, of course, the other thing that's famous about the beginning of the Great Depression, you may have heard about the Dust Bowl, which I was just talking about with that song that Woody Guthrie was talking about. In the early 1930s, the Great Plains, like in the Midwest, was gripped with horrible droughts, like a lack of rain. And it created these dust storms that sometimes they call black blizzards that went everywhere. And there's different theories about why it happened. I think some people seem to think that it was caused by maybe overgrazing and over farming and things like that in the West. And along with the droughts, it created these huge black clouds of dust that even went, you see, as far as the East Coast. That's how bad it was. Mostly was states like around Oklahoma, Kansas, upper part of Texas, even affecting Arkansas, and so on. And what happened was it created all these migrants that they couldn't farm and make any money. And so a lot of them fled westward. They became known as the so-called Okies or the Arkies. So the severe droughts and dust basically did this, creating a bunch of migrants. And of course, a lot of them decided, hey, I'm going to go west and go to California and all that, which a lot of them did to go work in some of the, I guess, working like, I guess they were mostly picking like plants, like fruit and stuff like that and things like that, vineyards and so on. in the West working there. I think there weren't a lot of jobs there was the problem, like too many people and not enough work. Of course, is one of the problems. So a lot of them fled. And of course, there was a famous writer, American writer you may have heard of, named John Steinbeck, who wrote a book about the Okies, which was called The Grapes of Wrath. You may have heard of it. Very famous book. And I remember reading that years ago. They've made movies out of it too, as well. I think there's a really good movie about it made right after. And so, yeah, like musicians, I told you, like Woody Guthrie. He also, I think, tried that too, go to California. He was more successful as a musician, rather than other things. But anyway, so that was the plight of the Okies, the Arkies, and all those people that tried to, flee to the West. And when they got there, there just weren't as many jobs, or they had jobs and weren't making that much money, so. But anyway, go ahead and move on. And of course, I'll talk about next. Here's, of course, a picture of the Okies and the Arkies. But let me get, of course, into next talking about what happened under Hoover. Hoover did do some things to try and alleviate the Great Depression. I know he's blamed for a lot of things, but he did try to do some things to help it out. So he did try to take some, government money and like under Hoover and like later FDR, Franklin D Roosevelt, they would later try to inject a lot of money into various projects from the government, like either from government money or from mostly money that they, I think, borrowed more than anything. I think the most famous thing they did under Hoover was they built a bunch of like construction projects to try to put people to work. The most famous was called Boulder Dam, which was built on the Colorado River. It was later now called Hoover Dam, which they renamed it in 1947. It was built in the 1930s, 1931 to 36. Yeah, it dammed the Colorado River basin. It was also important because it helped to create electricity for that area, like in part of Arizona and Nevada. It's part of why I guess Las Vegas develops later because of these hydroelectricity type dams that are constructed. They got Lake Powell, of course, nearby too, as well. And so, yeah, they built that. The only problem with that was it only employed a few thousand people. I think maybe around what I've looked up, only about 1932, it put about 3,000 people on the payroll actually building what would be later Hoover Dam. But basically, look at that, 10 to 20,000 people wanted to go to work there. They basically had unemployed people. All these people descended on there trying to, get jobs, and there just weren't enough jobs, for people, stuff like that. Hoover also came up with this thing through Congress that they passed, work with them to support the Emergency Relief and Construction Act. That was another thing they did too, 1932. That was probably the first major actual legislation that was created to help people in the Great Depression. They probably should have started earlier, like in 1930. I don't know why they didn't. But one of the main things it did was it created this corporation that was called the Reconstruction Finance Corporation. And what it did was it began loaning money to American businesses to help them get back on their feet. Kind of like what they were doing like with the coronavirus, that stimulus package that they created and all of that. And so what it did was it helped to put money into the economy, like about $2 billion was actually put into the economy to help people out and all that. So that's one of the first things that they really did. But apparently it wasn't enough. And by the way, it did kind of give you examples of some things they did with the money, by the way. They built mostly public works. They talk about one of the main things that they did, which was they helped construct the Brooklyn Navy Yard, which is in New York, which they'll later use that a lot, especially when World War II comes along. They also used a lot of the money to construct housing for people. And mostly all this was, like this money they were spending, I guess, more or less, was to create temporary work. That's kind of what the New Deal did too later. Create temporary work to help people, I guess put people to work because there were just not enough jobs, all that. Oh, before that, he also had, through Congress, he helped back this, approved the SmootHawley Tariff Act. You may have heard of this. It was a protectionist type tariff act that was passed by Congress. And what it did was it put tariffs on imported goods that were coming into the country, because going back to, I guess before that, they had kind of loosened that, like the tariff restrictions. And a lot of economists believe that had been one of the causes of the Great Depression, like high tariffs and all that between countries and all that. And so they put something like over 20,000 goods, they put higher tariffs on them. And what's funny is that they think that this act ended up doing the opposite. They believe it worsened the Great Depression. They probably should have lowered tariffs, but it of course didn't work. So like I said, overall, these were great, these ideas they were first trying to develop under Herbert Hoover. It didn't really do anything to really stop it, the Great Depression. And by the way, the Great Depression kept getting worse, and it would peak around 1932. Back in 1932, I think the unemployment was like something like 25%, which is a lot. So I don't know what it is now, 8 or 9%. They think now. Well, after that, everybody's been kind of going back to work, I guess, at least in some states anyway. They need to open everything back up, let people go back to work and stuff like that. But anyway, now there's one more thing I did want to talk about that happened under Hoover, which is very interesting. It's really hurt his reputation, and they think it maybe also hurt him from getting reelected along with the Great Depression. It was scarred by this incident where they call it the bonus marchers incident that happened in the summer of 1932. And what happened was in 1932, there was a group called the Bonus Expeditionary Force. They were called later, just for short, the Bonus Marchers. And who were these people? They were veterans of World War I. And they had been given these life insurance pensions, which they were given to them like in 1924. And they could redeem them not until 1945. However, the Great Depression happened. A lot of them didn't have any money. And so the marchers went to Washington to try to demand basically the money now. They wanted up front, basically. And apparently there was about close to 20,000 of them showed up to try to get the money early. Yeah, about 20,000. And of course, Herbert Hoover refused to pay them. They give them the money. I don't know if he had a right to even do it. I guess Congress had to do it, really. And so I think on the edge of Washington and parts of, I think not that far from the White House, I think it was, they set up shanty towns, and tried to basically decide to stay there and see if they could maybe negotiate with Hoover to maybe, give them, either pay him up front or maybe part of the money. I don't know, basically. And Hoover didn't want to have anything to do with it. And if you know what happened, Hoover sent in the military deal with it. The U.S. Army was actually sent in, literally, to break up this whole organization. And they actually brought in one of the generals you may have heard of named Douglas MacArthur. We've talked about him. He was a general by then, MacArthur. And he had this aide under him you may have heard of named Dwight Eisenhower. He was like a young aide that was under him. And also they had this other guy you may have heard of named George Patton, who was a major at the time. And Patton was the one that actually brought the forces in using tanks and stuff. And they broke it up. These tanks, bayonet, tear gas. And anyway, about 100-something people were injured when they basically rushed them. They burned it down. All the shanty towns were burned down by the military. And I think they say 2 babies died. They were smothered to death from the smoke inhalation, basically. So it really gave, Hoover a bad name because of that. And so they think that's partially what caused, his chances not to get reelected. But I think a lot of people seem to think that a lot of it still had to do with the Great Depression, why he wasn't reelected, more or less. Later, Franklin D. Roosevelt would get elected in 1932. There was a joke about the whole bonus marchers thing. And what happened was Hoover, of course, sent in the military, and FDR, who he sent? He sent his wife to talk to him. It was Eleanor Roosevelt. And so the joke was Hoover sent the army, Roosevelt sent his wife. So, I guess FDR would have done something different. They may have paid him. I don't know. But they probably should have done something better than using force to get rid of him. All right, moving on, of course, the next thing I want to talk about, of course, the 1932 presidential election, because we're going to, of course, be talking about Franklin D. Roosevelt in, of course, the New Deal that comes in. Now, presidential election of 1932, that was, of course, a very, very interesting election. At this time, the whole theme of the election was obviously about the Great Depression. So, or at least on the Democrat side, it was. I know on the Republican, it was like, it's kind of, sort of, more or less. And what happened was Hoover was renominated as the president for the Republican side, so the Republican nominee. This happened right before the bonus marchers incident. So you got to wonder if maybe that would have happened before. I wonder if they would have nominated him or not. It's hard to say about that. But so Hoover's nominated, and Hoover, those are some of the things he campaigned on, by the way, which is he wanted to balance the budget. He wanted to keep tariffs high, which of course they already did with the SmootHawley Tariff Act, of course. So he had all these protections policies, which I guess they think helped not alleviate the Great Depression. Oh, and he also ran on the idea to get rid of prohibition, which it's interesting how in 1928 he had been, of course, for it. So I guess he changed his mind about that. The Democrats ran on the same thing to get rid of prohibition too, as well. The Democrats, of course, chose Franklin D. Roosevelt, who was a governor of New York. He mostly campaigned on the fact that Hoover's administration hadn't really done enough to really alleviate the Great Depression. So he talked about all their failures and all that. And a little bit about Franklin D. Roosevelt. Roosevelt, was related to Teddy Roosevelt. He was a distant cousin. He did have a lot of political experience. He'd been a New York senator before. He'd also been Assistant Secretary of the Navy, which, Teddy Roosevelt had been also as well. He also ran for president, I think, around 1920. And he was actually the vice presidential nominee under James Cox when Cox lost to Warren Harding. Now, if you know about Roosevelt, he's known for being diagnosed with polio. You know about that in the early 20th century. That was a major illness that a lot of people got, including my mother. My mother had polio. I don't know if you know this or not. And it really messed up her legs. Like she has a lot of trouble walking. It didn't paralyze her like a lot of times polio does. But she remembers when she was a child how painful some of the treatments were for it. But it totally destroyed a lot of her muscles in her legs, and I think part of her back also as well. But of course, for Franklin D. Roosevelt, it paralyzed him, if you know about that. And of course, he was in a wheelchair, for years. So anyway, now he was governor of New York, 1928. And of course, he was known as being a reform type, pro-progressive kind of, governor. Maybe one of their best governors at that time, right after Al Smith came out of office. And anyway, so basically, you study about FDR. FDR campaigned on this theme he kind of came up with, which is called the New Deal. Of course, it's kind of a play off of his cousins. Remember, his idea is like the so-called square deal, if you remember correctly. And this included all kinds of reforms he wanted to do in government, reform the economy, agricultural changes, change in the stock market to reform it. He wanted to end prohibition, which they would. So he would help to end prohibition with Congress, which would later develop the 21st Amendment to do that. And also Roosevelt came up with the idea to create a lot of public works projects and programs to put a lot of Americans to work because of the fact that there weren't enough jobs out there. And the New Deal talked about the so-called 3 R's, which you may have heard of. The idea of relief, recovery, reform. And it's kind of like remember Teddy Roosevelt had the 3 C's. Remember that? So Teddy had the 3 C's and Franklin had the 3 R's. It's funny about that. And so it led to all these new federal programs, which we'll, of course, talk about later. Some are still around, some are gone, but these would be like the CCC, SSA, the AAA, the NIRA, NWPA, PWA, TVA. Of course, the Social Security Administration is this one. Tennessee Valley Authority, those are still around, of course, today. But some are still around, some are not. And later, as critics would call it the alphabet soup programs, because it was just like a bunch of programs they developed to kind of maybe try to help the Depression. And some believe it helped the Depression. Some people think it didn't do hardly anything. They could, hired some people, but didn't really, fix everything. And I think that most historians think later that the Great Depression really was mostly ended because of War II. The fact that really is what got us, over the hump, and all those war industries is what really, drove the economy eventually later to change. Now, of course, what ended up happening in the election, Franklin Roosevelt, it would be like a total reversal from 1928. In Roosevelt, FDR would win a total landslide over Herbert Hoover. FDR got 472 electoral votes. Hoover only got 59 electoral votes. So it was a total landslide victory for the Democrat side. I do have of course, a picture there. Of course, by the way, FDR ran on this new slogan, by the way, that was called "Happy Days Are Here Again." Of course, sort of. At the time, you had 10 million jobs that nobody had, 25% unemployment. So people were kind of debating whether they should, vote for him or not. But you can see that at least a good chunk of the population, almost 60%, voted for FDR. And of course, you can see that he won a majority of the states. So it looks like Hoover only won 6 states: Pennsylvania, Delaware, Connecticut, Vermont, New Hampshire, and Maine. That's it. Roosevelt did pretty good with this election. So he won like 42 states. Wow, that's pretty good, more or less. So we're going to get more into, of course, the New Deal. And of course, one thing we'll get into later with, Franklin D. Roosevelt. He's very famous, for being elected president 4 times: 1932, 1936, 1940, 1944. I think part of why he stayed in office was because of World War II and all that. But he was elected, like I said, 4 times. He developed a lot of advisors under him that were known as the Brain Trust. You can see he brought all these people in to kind of help him try to alleviate the problems of the Great Depression. And so The first 100 days, if you study about his administration from like about March to like June, July, um, the one of the first things that they started doing was they started developing different programs that were part of the New Deal. I need to put this slide right here, if you don't mind. So FDR comes into office at that point, and of course, one of the most famous things that happened at the beginning of him getting elected was, of course, his famous inauguration speech that he gave in March of 1933. This became known as the famous speech about the only thing we have to fear itself. And in the speech, he said that this is preeminently the time to speak the truth, the whole truth, frankly and boldly. Nor need we shrink from honestly facing conditions in our country today. This great nation will endure as it has endured, will revive and will prosper. So first, let me assert my firm belief that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself, nameless, unreasoning, unjustified terror, which paralyzes needed efforts to convert retreat into advance. So probably considered one of the great speeches that he makes, that and the Day of Infamy speech when the Japanese attacked, Pearl Harbor and all that. So one of the first things that, of course, FDR would start doing, he would work with Congress to try to alleviate the problems of the administration. And so for the first 100 days, they started coming up with all these New Deal programs. And predominantly they used what they call pump priming, basically to pay for a lot of these programs, which developed different reforms, relief, recovery that we talked about. And they basically attempted to stimulate the economy by trying to do massive spending. That's usually what they do sometimes when you have a bad recession or a depression. They try to basically loan a bunch of money and try to, use that money to break the depression, hope it stimulates the economy enough so they could create more revenue. And then from there, they don't have to borrow as much money and all that. So that's basically what, FDR did, with the New Deal and all that. And so one of the first things that they did at the beginning of the Great Depression was they first started doing a bunch of legislation with the banking industry, which I want to talk about first. So you got the alphabet soup programs. And of course, one of the first things they did was they passed what they call Congress the Emergency Banking Relief Act. What that did was it basically the U.S. government went and it closed the banks. They had like a kind of like a banking holiday, basically. And the Congress and the government decided like what banks would survive and what wouldn't. Like the ones that were credit worthy or whatever, those would be closed down that weren't. And then they would keep the ones open that were good. And then they also created the FDIC. You've probably heard about this as well, which is still around today. The FDIC. It's called the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. What that did, it was created to insure people's money in bank accounts, like your checking savings account. And initially, it insured money up to $2,500. It didn't much back then, but now today it's about $250,000. And so part of why they did this was to basically get people to want to put money in the bank. Because a lot of people didn't trust the banks. The banks had all closed. They'd lost all their money. And many cases, a lot of people, what they were doing with their money? They were putting it like in their mattress. They were putting it in their shoes. There were stories about how they would like put money in tin cans and bury them in the backyard because they didn't trust the banks and all that. I remember a story one of my uncles told me how it was years ago during the Great Depression when they had this all going on. You remember how they, I think it was one story how he had taken some money and he put it in a shoe because he didn't want to put it in the bank. And it ended up getting thrown away by accident. So he had to go to the dump to try to find it. I don't know how much money it was. You remember Tim telling me that story about that. And so, yeah, that's why they, wanted to create all these reforms with the banking industry so people would have more faith in the banks and want to put, money in the banks overall. Here's the FDIC. Of course, you may have seen this sticker here on the door when you go in front of in a bank or whatever. And so, yeah, that's something that FDR helped develop with the U.S. Congress. So that's like really one of the first New Deal reforms that they really did with, the government, more or less, with the economy. Also, another thing they did too, which was famous, they tried to put people to work. You may have heard of the PWA, which was developed in 1933, which is the Public Works Administration. This was done and created to provide jobs because, like I told you, there was a lot of people that were, unemployed throughout the country. And mostly what the PWA did was it created a lot of large-scale public works, construction, and all. It was a construction administration predominantly. They built dams, they built bridges, they built hospitals, they built warships for the U.S. Navy. They built a lot of schools, like hundreds of schools were built by the PWA. And they spent something like $6-7 billion on construction projects throughout the United States. And it was run by the Secretary of Interior, a guy named Harold Ickes. You may have heard of him. One of those brain trust guys, I guess, that was under FDR and existed for almost 10 years. It was around up to World War II. However, a lot of critics seem to think that it didn't really help to alleviate the Depression like it should have. And the industrial output of the country still was lagging, even though they were to do all these, new kind of programs like this. So it kind of helped a little bit, but probably didn't do enough to help people overall with the economy. They also had the WPA, which you may have heard of, which is called the Works Progress Administration. It's probably more famous than the PWA. It started around 1935, 1936. And this one, sometimes they kind of count it as the second New Deal, if you really read about that period. And they built a lot of public buildings. It's something they were known for. They built roads. I believe, if I'm not mistaken, I think the WPA may have helped to build Route 66, if you know that highway that ran from Chicago all the way to California. I think they may have built part of it, or maybe they did. I think they did build it, if I'm not mistaken. WPA was run by Harry Hopkins, another brain trust guy, very famous under FDR. They hired a lot of people too, close to 8 million people were hired between 1935 to 1943. They hired all kinds of people, not just construction workers and things like that. They hired people also like actors and artists and musicians. I don't know if you've ever been in some buildings, I know at LSU, they've got all these mural paintings that are on the wall that are really old. A lot of these were done by these WPA artists. They were part of a project that was called the Federal Project Number 1. So they were trying to hire all kinds of people and try to employ people and get people to, go to work and stuff like that. Also, other things they came up with too, as well. You may have heard of the CCC. That's something that's also very famous. That was also created with the so-called First New Deal that happened in the early 1930s. This was a project which employed national youth. You can see 17 or 18 to about 25. They employed about 500,000 or men or so, young men, to work on a lot of these various projects. Most of them were bachelors. They weren't married or anything like that. And you can see they did all kinds of projects. They worked, with conservation projects primarily. it's kind of like the Boy Scouts, but they're working with conservation projects, planting forests. They would clear swamps, built small dams. They built public parks. I don't know if you've ever been to Cosachi National Park, which is around Alexandria, kind of central part of Louisiana. That park, national, I guess it's like is that a national park? I guess it is. That park basically was developed by the CCC. You know about that as an example. So yeah, that started in 1933, and they lived in camps, by the way. That's one thing they were known for. So a lot of them were unmarried. They came from these poor families. They would live together in work camps. They were paid wages, which a lot of this money that they got, by the way, would be sent home. Basically, I don't know if it was $3 million, but maybe it was. But how many it was. There was a lot of men I know that were in it. And a lot of the money was sent home back to their parents to, help alleviate with the Great Depression. And a lot of these men, if you know about it later, were recruited by the U.S. Army and so on to fight in World War II. So they went from being in the CCC to being in the military, as example. Another one I'll mention too is they have the National, there's a picture right there. They have the National Youth Administration, was something else that was also created during the Great Depression. What was that? It was a program to hire youth from what is basically from what is schools. Anyway, what happened was they hired up to like several 100,000 men to basically work on various projects around like campuses and stuff like that. I'm not sure why I got removed from. Figure that out. What happened? Got taken out. I'm not sure why. But anyway, so yeah, they hired to pay wages, and a lot of the money went to their families. I don't know what happened. Lost it. Anyway, so yeah, the NYA, that's something that was very important. I think my mom may have told me stories about this, but when she was young and living in the, I'm born in 1937, they had that kind of thing going on, at that time in the 1940s. All right, so the NYA, they had that. A few more things I want to talk about as well that they had besides the NYA. I also want to talk about the farmers, because the farmers, they got a lot of aid too during the Great Depression as well. So a few programs they developed which were very famous. They had the Farm Credit Administration. You may have heard about that. That was a famous program developed by the New Deal. What that did was enable farmers to get cheap loans, which could protect their farmland so that they wouldn't get foreclosed on, and also could protect their crops, keep growing crops. And some of the loans were up to actually 50 years, which is kind of ridiculous for that. And also the interests were also really low, as low as like 2.5%. So this is all done to prevent farmers from getting their farms foreclosed on, which was something that happened a lot in the Great Depression, where farmers, lost their land and all that. So that was one of them right there. They also had the, I'm trying to think, I don't have it in here somewhere. Where is it? I don't think I've got it in here, but they also have what they call the AAA. I'm trying to think where I can find that, which is right there. on that screen. That was something else they had, the AAA. The AAA was something that was famous too. There are actually two of these acts. The first one was in 1933, called the Agricultural Adjustment Act of 1933. What that one was it was created by Congress to reduce the amount of farm produce or commodity that was being produced by farmers. A lot of economists believe that part of why the Great Depression happened was because farmers were overproducing. And so decreased commodity prices. I think wheat was going for $2, $3 a bushel. And then after the stock market crash and all that, Great Depression started, it went down like $1. So they believe that that was part of maybe what caused it. Although they think what happened later was the AAA, you know much about it, it was declared unconstitutional. And so they had to get rid of it. It wasn't around that long, but I think for 4 or 5 years. They replaced it with another one, which is the Agricultural Act. And by the way, there was a court case here, right here, you see on the screen, which is called United States versus Butler. That went all the way to the Supreme Court, and it was declared unconstitutional by the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court said basically that the Congress had no constitutional right to regulate agricultural production. That power, lay with the states, and so they replaced it with the Agricultural Adjustment Act of 1938, the second one. And what this one did, it paid farmers not to grow crops, is what it did. And they agreed to farm only like a half or maybe 1/4 of their acres in exchange for money subsidies as part of how it worked, basically. But a lot of critics didn't really like the A. That's the 1933 what I'm talking about, actually. 1933, that's a typo. That should be 33, not 38. 1933 one, that's basically what it did. So it was like actually trying to prevent farmers from really farming and all of that. And critics of that were really mad about it because people were starving. Like, they actually created a shortage, like a natural, like not a natural, like a man-made shortage was actually created because of this act, by Congress. So some farmers weren't even farming half their fields and things like that. I guess my uncle who owned a lot of land must have I guess he got paid for subsidies to not farm, basically, more or less. So let me talk about I think 1 or 2 more things, and that's it for this lecture for the I guess the so-called first New Deal, which we're kind of talking about with the Great Depression. Now, 2 more things I'll mention about too. They also had the Homeowners Loan Corporation, which was also created as well because of the Great Depression. What was that? This was a federal agency that allowed homeowners to borrow money at low interest rates, kind of like the farmers, like the one I told you about, which was the FCA, was kind of like the other version. In fact, the FCA was the farmer version of the HOLC. So that meant that people could get cheaper mortgage loans at lower interest rates, which I think the interest rates were like maybe 2 or 3% at lowest, I thought, or something like that. It's pretty low, I know. And at one point it was 2 or 3%. And mainly why they created it was to prevent people from getting their houses foreclosed on, because that, like I said, had been a major problem during the Great Depression, people losing their houses and all of that. So it's like basically a U.S. government corporation that pretty much, help people to get cheap mortgages, by the thousands. But a lot of people still couldn't get it. If you know much about it, there was a negative side of the HOLC. It created a racial divide in segregated housing, which is known for a long time in American history. If you know about it, neighborhoods were divided on what they call redlining. You may have heard of redlining, right? And the HOLC is what started it. It's what started the whole redlining. And so if somebody was a minority, like say black or some Hispanic or some minority that wasn't white, they would charge them more for like a mortgage, like interest rate, basically. And or they wouldn't loan them any money at all. Was of course the other thing that they would do. And so the banks tended to want to loan money to people that had more money, more than anything. Also too, I'll mention also that was created as well at the same time. You may have heard of the Federal Housing Administration, which is still around today. That, of course, was also developed as well. That administration encourages banks to lend money to homeowners that want to like build new houses, repair their house as well. They also offer cheap interest rates as well. Of course, the FHA is still around today. A lot of people buy houses, build houses that way by getting an FHA loan. I think I may have used that before too myself, I think, when I got my first house years ago as well. So all these are, New Deal programs that were created, during the Great Depression and all that. And of course, I'm not finished with the New Deal. I'm going to, of course, talk about later, the rest of the New Deal, what Franklin D. Roosevelt does, and then, of course, after that, I'll talk more about the 1930s, the years between World War I and World War II, because we're going to eventually get to World War II coming up, which hopefully we'll get to within a week or so. So that's pretty much it for today with this lecture. Of course, on Tuesday next week, which I believe is that's the October 27th, I'm going to wrap up this period, like on the Great Depression, the New Deal. And that's probably where your second exam is going to pretty much stop, more or less. Okay. Now, before I go, don't forget, you've got some assignments, that are due tonight. Of course, you've got the Canvas quiz you got on Taft. Now, what is it? Teddy Roosevelt, Taft, and Wilson era. You got to finish up. And then, of course, don't forget, I did post, of course, that new Canvas quiz on World War I era you need to kind of start working on. And that'll be due, of course, next week. So that's it for today. Hope y'all have a good weekend coming up. I'll see you later with another lecture. So you take care.